It is Friday, December 2nd, 2022, and you have found the Living Youth Podcast. My name is Wallace Smith, and I'm sitting across the table from my co-host, Mr. John Robinson. Mr. Robinson, so good to see you again today.
Thank you, and good afternoon to you.
I mean, we've been sitting here for like 30 minutes, I think, but suddenly the mic's on. It's
You would think by now that we could just set this podcast up in like 30 seconds, but
we don't.
We're getting there. That's our goals for 2023.
Podcast goals 2023. Now that this is like the third episode, we believe, for season 2. We think so. Mm-hmm. Mr. Robinson, what is our topic today?
Our topic today is actually a suggestion from, I assume youth, actually. I realize I don't know the age, but we had a listener suggest talking about gossiping. How dangerous it is, how toxic it is, and that is right in our wheelhouse, and we would love to talk about that.
That sounds like a fantastic topic. Let's get after it. Welcome back. Thank you, Jake and Julia, and thank you for our listener who wrote in and asked for this topic, and we would like to encourage anyone who has thoughts, either feedback for Mr. Robinson or myself, or ideas for topics or Bible questions. We'd love to address some Bible questions. Please do feel free and email us at podcast@livingyouth.org. podcast@livingyouth.org. That goes straight to me and to Mr. Robinson. And we would love to hear from you. So this topic is gossip, and appreciate it. And we didn't, there's, people often suggest topics. They don't say what age they are, but we generally understand it is teens and young adults listening, and families. I know, Mr. Robinson, I think you too have heard of from families who sometimes listen on Friday nights or something together. And I will say that at least, I was a young person once, Mr. Robinson, and some of the temptations of gossip can certainly draw us in. In fact, the Bible actually talks about that, and I thought I'm going to just lead out of the gate with that. It's actually an interesting descriptive passage, and it's mentioned twice in the Proverbs 18, verse 8, and Proverbs 26 and verse 22. Where they say, the words of a talebearer are like tasty trifles, and they go down into the inmost body. Now, there's different translations that have different takes on that, but I've always really liked that because, frankly, it resonates with me that, hearing some kind of inside word about somebody, it's like, oh, hey, really, you can have these kind of itching ears where you almost kind of, want to hear, especially if it's something that's going to make you feel that much better about yourself as opposed to someone else. But then also, who doesn't want to be the person who bears such tasty trifles to others, and to be the bearer of sort of secret inside knowledge in that way. And so let me just, confess up front. I like to think I've grown to a great degree. Of course, we're all still human. But no, I'm sympathetic to this, and I know when it comes to all the drama, intrigue that can sometimes be associated with our younger years, then all the more there's so many opportunities for that temptation to take root.
Well, my interest in this was piqued actually a couple of years ago when there was a Bible study theme, a little over 2 years ago. This is when the theme was developed, and I had the opportunity of being one of the first, because it's a rotation of men that do the Bible study, and so I think I was the first one actually, and the way the question was framed was, and it wasn't specifically gossip, it was a little more social media oriented. Hey, with social media out there, man, does the Bible have anything to say about that? And I love the question: does this ancient the newest scriptures are 2,000 years old? Can this ancient document really, how could it have foreseen the rise of Facebook and Twitter and all these things? Right. And I was like, oh, no. We're not different. Just our methods to reach people are different. And really actually, so the direction I went was the guidance in the Bible matters more than ever because of the reach we have and how it's a magnifying effect also of if we say something insensitive or we don't have all the facts on Facebook or Twitter or whatever, like instead of it, think back how America was even a little, or most places were over 100 years ago. Lots of small towns. You talk about the village this and the village that.
Right.
It's kind of limited how many people you could reach, but now you could have a Facebook following of hundreds or thousands of people, and all of a sudden what you're
Right.
saying goes to a lot of people, and instantly.
And even if you don't personally have such a following, the fact is you're all still interconnected. So someone passes along something you said, and that gets passed along, and next thing you know, it has reached that many. It really is an amplifying voice, and that's I'll try to find the title. I'll do my best to add a link in this particular case, because you did write that particular as a Living Church News article about the different people you'll meet online on social media. And when you made that point back then, I really appreciate it. It's like, yeah, here's this ancient, dusty document. I don't think I've ever, well, I'm sure it's been said that way, but when you said a while ago, the newest scriptures were made almost 2,000 years ago, those are the newest ones. And yet it speaks so directly and relevantly to social media and Facebook and what you do on Instagram. It really is astonishing. And that is, I'm not just, kissing. I mean, hey, actually, technically in editorial, I'm your boss, so I can't kiss.
That's right.
I'm not kissing
No.
up to you.
Thank you for the praise.
But it is such a good article, and I'll do my best to make sure. Hey, if you're listening, teens, young adults, well, of course you're listening because you're listening. I'll make sure I put that at livingyouth.org there on the post, and so you can click on that article to read it. It's very good.
I don't even remember the title to my own article. But one of the points I tried to make in it, and that we'll try to do here in this podcast is, the rules of proper discourse and the rules governing our interpersonal relationships haven't changed. They're not any different. Things that would have hurt in a smaller environment, just directly to other people, hurt online. There's nothing new about the way we communicate other than the magnification of the reach and the number of people. But the way we relate to each other has not changed. I thought we might start. So I can't believe I had not looked this up before. But I searched my New King James Version just before we started, and there was only one instance of the word gossip showing up in the whole Bible. The rest of it is actually used, other words describe it. So the English word gossip was only used in one place, which was 1 Timothy 5:13. I'll go ahead and read it. It says, "And besides, they learn to be idle, wandering about from house to house, and not only idle, but also gossips and busybodies, saying things which they ought not." So what I thought I might do is, the Greek word for gossips is, I think the pronunciations are a little fluid. It's plueros, and it means to boil, to bubble as with heat. A tattler on an idle or trifling talker, one who boils over with impertinent talk. And impertinent is like kind of disrespectful a little bit. Now, the English word for gossip, which I thought was also interesting, which plays into what you said a little bit earlier, the English word for gossip is casual or unconstrained conversation or reports about other people, typically involving details that are not confirmed as being true. But I really like the point that you made that even if you have all the facts, you do have all the facts, and that it is accurate and true, it can still just as easily be gossip.
Right. Unnecessary to share and damaging potentially, and just something that would still be wiser to handle with discretion. And I'm sure discretion is going to be coming up.
So I have one quote.
Okay.
So I wonder how many of our listeners have heard of Will Rogers.
Oh, yeah.
Even when I was growing up, Will Rogers was not that prominent anymore, but you heard a lot about what Will Rogers said, and he always dispensed little gems. He said, "The only time people dislike gossip is when you gossip about them." And I thought that was a pretty good one. So I am borrowing from my own article, not to be self-serving, but as I went and reviewed it again, apparently not paying attention to the title, I thought this already laid out in part my view on the idea of gossiping. We'll probably just continue to stick with the English word for it. But I break it down into, in the article, several categories. But for biblical usage, there are two types of gossips. There is a busybody and there is a talebearer. And I thought we could spend the rest of our day. I have paid attention to some of the feedback we've gotten from listeners, and that while our conversations can be interesting, we don't always necessarily gave keys to maybe something you could do about it. And so we
Right.
want to end with some keys about suggestions on maybe ways to managing gossip. But before we get to that, the busybody. Should I go ahead and just read 1 Peter and then we can take
Oh,
it
yeah,
from
that
there?
sounds great.
Okay.
Let's do that.
All right. 1 Peter 4, and I'll read 12 through 16 because it's short, and I always like having a little context around things. But it says, "Beloved, do not think it strange concerning the fiery trial which is to try you, as though some strange thing happened to you. But rejoice to the extent that you partake of Christ's sufferings, that when his glory is revealed, you may also be glad with exceeding joy. If you are reproached for the name of Christ, blessed are you, for the Spirit of glory and God rests upon you. On their part he is blasphemed, but on your part he is glorified." Now here's the key. "But let none of you suffer as a murderer, as a thief, an evildoer, or as a busybody in other people's matters. Yet if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in this manner." And so one of the things that stood out to me when I first read this, in fact, I want to say this stood out to me in something that was not originally related to the article or the first presentation I did, was that why would you think that a busybody would be included in a group of I think most people would consider murdering about as bad as it gets in terms of crime,
Right.
thief, evildoer. This is a pretty tough group of things to be grouped together, and then a busybody.
Right. If some reason let's say I were arrested for some reason, I'm not going to even hypothesize on what such reason could be. But they say, okay, you got a choice. You can be in this room with a murderer. It's like, oh, I don't want to be with a murderer, or this room with a thief, or this room with an evildoer, which who knows what that could be, right? That's pretty. Or this room with a busybody. I would think, really? Busybody? You're lumping busybody in with murdering and thieving and doing evil? And yet it's right there. Verse 15, Peter does. He lists that there. What are we supposed to take from something like that?
Well, my conclusion was, what's the other scripture that describes the tongue as like the rudder of a ship? It's very small, but it can. In fact, if you've ever seen any kind of sailing vessel, it is actually stunning to me how small the rudder is relative to the overall size of the sailing vessel in many cases. But it totally turns the ship in every which direction. And so the tongue, such a dangerous little organ in our body, capable of so much harm. And I think the conclusion we should take from this is, do not underestimate how dangerous and how toxic this is to your social network or your community or your environment, to have somebody in it who's constantly going around, in its extreme, absolutely in everybody's business, gathering little data points, and then what are they going to do with that? Well, I'm going to talk about it.
Right. Because it goes on, verse 15, the full statement there, it says, "Or as a busybody in other people's matters." And that's part of what we're losing today. And especially, it seems like with every generation, it's worse. And so, teens and young adults, this definitely lands on you guys as well, is that we're losing the sight of boundaries. What's really even, appropriate? It's like we need to be able to respect other people's spaces, other people's circumstances. Nowadays you can go on Facebook or something and you might see I took a picture of my lunch. You kind of know a little bit about everybody. We're so used to oversharing, we tend to forget that, well, that's not normal. It's not even necessarily healthy. But let alone when you're driving to be involved in everybody else's business. See, do you really have to know this about that person over there? You've heard some hint that maybe so-and-so's marriage is in such and such condition. Do you really need to go and pry and learn more? Or can you respect the fact that, they're them and I'm me? Yep. Their business is their business. What do I need to be involved in that in any way?
He said that to you? What else?
Right.
Well, so there are 3 words in the Bible that are translated as busybody. Okay. So this one we have here, and I hope we don't lose our audience by getting into words too much, but the definitions are fantastic. So the Greek word used here means used of people who scurry about, fussing over and meddling in other people's affairs, being overwrought with unnecessary care. But there was a second part of the definition that I thought was absolutely fascinating. It goes on, it was also a standard term for black arts or magic. It pointed to the length and various rituals involved in incantations, ceremonies, and the fastidiousness which they were performed.
How
Yeah, that is
interesting.
interesting.
If you could imagine, because it kind of explains there what you saw, but the fastidious nature in which the rituals were performed. If you could imagine seeing someone going around involving themselves in other people's business, what was the phrase you said? Oh, with unnecessary care, just overwrought with details, concern about other people's lives, going around kind of occupying themselves and running from place to place. And then you imagine that as someone involved in some magical ritual, having to go and get the hair from the goat here and then and dropping that in the cauldron and going and doing this, then suddenly it kind of takes on a really different picture. But what a literal translation or understanding of the word busybody, someone who their body's running around just being overly busy as involving themselves in a bunch of little details, scurrying about for things that it's not there. It's like back in my day. Well, actually, it's before my day. I grew up on a lot of television, more than I should have, and watching a lot of old syndicated reruns from the 60s and even the 50s. But there was the stereotype of the nosy neighbor. A lot of sitcoms had one, and it was the neighbor who's constantly peeking out of her window to see what the other neighbors are doing so she can talk with everybody else. It's like, what difference does it make? Close your blinds, go do something profitable someplace else. But investing herself in everybody other's lives to an extent that it's just, it's beyond what it really should be.
Right. Well, when you put the other words together, it forms a more complete picture. So we just keep seeing it as busybody in the English, but it's made up of these other words, so it brings a little nuance to it.
Okay.
And one of them adds the idea of judging others rather than judging yourself. You're a busybody in everybody's business, and you're starting to make judgments about what's going on in their lives. And it's kind of it makes sense, doesn't it, that they're judging others instead of themselves, because what would we rather do? Not worry about taking care of our own problems. But the other thing, that the definition that brings it full circle, which I like because you already mentioned it, was to go beyond proper boundaries, which is kind of the definition of presumptuous, is to either not be aware of or not honor boundaries that have been drawn. Brene Brown had one of the better simple definitions for this that I love. I still use it off and on to this day, which is relationships are defined by boundaries. This is okay. This isn't. And so it makes perfect sense. Every single relationship we have, my wife, my children, my work ones, whether we fully, could articulate them or not, they are defined by boundaries. And there's parts of the relationship, don't ask about that because they're sensitive about this or whatever. It doesn't even have to be sensitivities. It doesn't even mean you have an irrational boundary. It's just that, but we all have them. And so the busybody ignores all of that.
Doesn't care,
gets into whatever they want and starts to set themselves up as something of a judge over other people. So you can start to see why this is pretty terrible, toxic behavior, because they're not quiet about it. And they go about spreading or talking to whatever willing audience they can find.
It is kind of interesting if you think about it. I'm sure to a certain extent, part of the motivation is to not be quiet because you want to talk about these things. It's kind of a pastime. It's what you do. But even really, if let's say you didn't talk about it for some reason, let's say, I don't know, you're banned from speaking for a month or writing, but still, if you just the spirit that motivates you to dig into all these other details is itself a violation of boundaries to a certain extent.
Right.
It's like I mentioned here, so preoccupied with judging other people when the Bible continuously presses each of us to focus on ourselves, right? To focus on where you are in your relationship with God. And I have known individuals over the years, even before being in the church, and hopefully have not been such a person. We all have to definitely examine ourselves, but someone who's so invested in the faults or concerns or something of other people that they're just utterly blind to the things going on in their own life. And all the more attention you're investing in those lives and other people, then that's attention that's not being spent where it really should be. And as someone said once, wish I could think of the phrase exactly. It's not coming to mind. It was generally in terms of, tell you what, it was so brilliant. Imagine I said something really brilliant, and I'll mention it if it happens to come to mind.
You say many brilliant things. Now, what you need to say is, "It will come to me."
Oh, it'll come.
The-
Oh, that's right. Speak that, and
I would
it's
say
likely
that's
to
the
come to
best
me.
tip I ever got from Mr. Ames, but that would like trivialize his contribution in a way that I don't intend to. He says many wise things. That's one that's always stuck with me. Though.
Right.
It'll come to me.
Well,
'Cause-
it'll come to me.
yeah, it'll come to you. Okay, so let's transition to the talebearer. But
Okay.
as we do that, I might make mention because there's a reason there's different words for these people. Like the talebearer and the busybody overlap, but I do think there's a couple critical differences. The busybody, I think we've all seen someone, hopefully not many, and I don't even think that they're aware of just how they're being or how they're perceived. It's maybe you can imagine a fairly extroverted people person, and they are interested in people and have a kind of a care and concern, and they're
Right.
just out there, just out there being kind of, well, what you should do is, and then but they may not even be aware of how much that they're doing that, whereas the talebearer is a bit more calculated.
Okay.
The Leviticus 19:16 introduces the idea of the talebearer. You shall not go about as a talebearer among your people, nor shall you take a stand against the life of your neighbor. I am the Lord. And I think we've probably said this on the podcast before, but always take notes of I am the Lord's. That's like an three exclamation. If you're texting, that's 3 to 5 exclamation marks at the end of a verse.
I want to say Mr. Wesson's given a whole. I mean, I think it was in Kansas City once, and heard him. He was visiting and gave a whole sermon about God using that statement in multiple places. And when it is said, you need to be paying attention to that.
Right.
So.
Yeah, no, that's good. Okay, so what is this word? So the Hebrew word, it paints kind of a grim picture of this person. It's one who goes about with the intent of gathering slanderous information about others. It denotes one who is a slanderer, an informer, a scandalmonger, traveling about. And as I recall, when I did the study on this, the traveling kind of caravan trader marketing idea was in there. I mean, it really is.
Interesting.
The words paint a description of somebody they know what they're looking for. And they're out there on the
Right.
trail, and they're visiting the various marketplaces and seeing what they can trade and what they can come up with. And they don't want just necessarily idle gossip. I'm sure that's fine as well. But what they are looking for is dirt. They're out there trying to find things that they could be useful to them, or that they could use to slander other people. I'm sure most people don't think of it that way,
Right.
but that's what the Bible is describing here.
It's like currency for them.
Yes.
Either to spend to raise themselves, possibly to lower others, but to accomplish something. So it's actually bearing tales for purpose and for cause. Interesting.
So let's take note of Proverbs 26:20. We try not to read lengthy sections on here, but this is a good one. And this really gets down to, the reason I chose this one is it mentions this idea, but also starts to highlight how dangerous the tongue can be used improperly.
Right.
Okay, it's Proverbs 26, verses 20 through 28. Where there is no wood, the fire goes out, and where there is no talebearer, strife ceases. As charcoal is to burning coals and wood to fire, so is a contentious man to kindle strife. The words of a talebearer are like tasty trifles, and they go down into the inmost body. Fervent lips with a wicked heart are like earthenware covered with silver dross. In other words, it's like taking something that's nice and good, but coating it with something that makes it
Not good.
not good.
Right.
Verse 24, he who hates disguises it with his lips and lays up deceit within himself. When he speaks kindly, do not believe him, for there are 7 abominations in his heart. Though his hatred is covered by deceit, his wickedness will be revealed before the assembly. Whoever digs a pit will fall into it, and he who rolls a stone will have it rolled back on him. A lying tongue hates those who are crushed by it, and a flattering mouth works ruin.
Wow. And that did use that passage that I mentioned earlier. And that's part of what I would think the talebearer knows, is they really are trafficking someone who does bear tales for cause. They're trafficking in something they know people are going to want to hear. They know they have something to trade. They know that they have a secret, some lack of discretion, something they know about someone that they're able to use to maybe ingratiate themselves with someone else. They know that they are, in a sense, a merchant of tasty trifles.
Did you remember? Tell me if you have this recollection, because I want to say Dr. Meredith mentioned this idea several times, and that, I mean, this has to go back 40 years. He mentioned that there was somebody at Ambassador College. I don't remember if they were a student or in the administration. It sounded like there was somebody that worked there who had a literal black book where they wrote down things like this so that they kept track of information that they could use in the future.
I do not know. I can think of a cartoon character that does that, but I don't know if I remember hearing a story about a person who used to do that.
The Bible describes them like a cartoon character. But it's interesting because also within this is you start to realize even the talebearer, the talebearer is actually kind of unrealistic about what they're doing, and they kind of deceive themselves as well, as I think part of the implication here. And you and I have talked a lot about lying, and so people ask the question all the time, well, what's the problem with a little white lie? And I found I didn't have a good answer to that, but I feel like I have a better answer now. Some of the podcasts I've been listening to are, there's one individual in particular who's gone on several podcasts, and he's so good at talking about it. I listen to him on different podcasts, but he is an expert. He has a PhD in how the brain functions.
Neurology.
Yeah, neurology. Right. That's it. The words he uses all the time, he describes the brain as a learning machine and a prediction machine. But he constantly uses the word mapping. Map. Our brain is filled with maps. And we can either map reality or we can map something else.
Right.
And the more your map has errors in it, what a little white lies, there are errors in reality. And the more of them you accumulate, and the more you have an inaccurate map of reality. And so what's the description down here? Whoever digs a pit will fall into it. Part of the idea there is for other scriptures that are talking about falling into a pit or into the ditch. In part, it's because they've deceived themselves, and their view of reality is inaccurate. And so, if you're following your map of reality, which does not correlate with reality, you end up falling somewhere that you didn't intend.
Right. That's really interesting because what is a talebearer doing? They're trafficking in information. It can be misinformation. It doesn't necessarily have to be accurate, but they're not really motivated by what is true. They're motivated by what they're going to gain, what they're going to gain in the sentiment with their friends, what they're going to gain in maybe in terms of position or the esteem of others, or gain in tearing someone else down, whatever it might be. But the moment you move from where your concern isn't what's true, well, then you can't guarantee that you're really setting yourself up for deceit, because now you're open to hearing things that may not be true, but they satisfy your goals. Right. They satisfy the kind of thing you want to hear about.
In some sense, you don't care if it's true.
Yeah, exactly right. It still serves the purpose, because that's one thing I like to highlight, and I won't go into it too much because I think I've emphasized it in, I don't want to say 2 sermons in a row, but I know I did in 2 sermons recently, that when it comes to slander, or let's not say slander necessarily, when it comes to accusation about individuals and just spreading that around. Well, that's what the devil does to us, to the Father, right? He's looking to tear us down. He's looking to gain a diminished relationship between God and one of his children. He's looking to do damage to us. And don't get me wrong, the devil does lie. I'm sure that not everything he tells God is necessarily truthful. It's in his nature to lie. But at the same time, the devil is often at his most effective, at least in terms of what I've seen in the lives of people around me and in my own life, is whenever he actually has a seed of truth to work with.
Right.
The devil, and at least I can confess in my life, I probably make enough mistakes to give the devil more than enough to work with, where he could be before God in heaven and accusing me of mistakes I actually have made. But does that mean God is still pleased with that? And so I don't want God looking over the devil's shoulder to see me talebearing about someone for whatever purposes, when he sees the devil doing exactly the same thing in the same visual frame. So to a certain extent, talebearing isn't about whether it's true or false. Just because you're bearing a tale that might be true doesn't mean you're not necessarily a talebearer that comes under God's condemnation, because some people will excuse that. Oh, but what I'm saying is true. What different? Well, still, what is your motivation? Why are you doing that?
Man,
but going back to what you're saying, that if the motivation is also to gain something from it, well, then actually maybe it's true now, but you're opening yourself
Yep.
up to something that's false in the future.
We should really ask ourselves as honestly as possible, which is difficult because, the heart is desperately deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. We really should ask ourselves, what's our motivation? Because maybe in your own brain, you have something that is kind of a bit of a tasty trifle and you want to share it with your friends. And maybe it's okay. You and I were talking in the show prep about how you can take this idea too far and feel like anything that you say about somebody else is going to be taken as gossip.
Right. Or sometimes you're afraid, like, we know that we have a lot of teens and young adults listening where you don't even want to say something to your parents because you don't want to say something. Well, let me say, I hope if you're listening and you're a young individual that you do share things with your parents, but ask yourself, why are you sharing it? Is it just because it's going to feel good to tear Susie down or to, say something nasty about Bobby? Or is it because your parents are a part of your life? Maybe you've seen something troubling, and give your parents the opportunity to teach you how to handle information like that.
Because maybe you do have a friend that is engaging in destructive behavior, like that they're going to hurt themselves.
Yeah, you should pass.
But you don't want to. You don't want to. You feel like they're your friend, and you gotta. No, there are times where you need to speak up for that person's sake.
Yeah, you're not gossiping to go to your parents, or to talk to a minister or to seek out the right individuals to say something. That's not the same thing as gossip. That's actually that often, in fact, the Bible praises the friend who's willing to wound instead of kiss, really.
Yeah.
There's a time when you really do need to reach out. And so asking yourself and understanding your motivations is one of the ways to understand, well, am I being a busybody? Am I being a talebearer? Am I being a gossip? You definitely need to examine yourself and understand your motivations in that regard.
So as we get ready to pivot to the 3 tools I have prepared for our listeners, I might mention as we conclude this that this is the tip of the iceberg on what the Bible has to say about these kind of topics. To me, what was eye-opening is if you just take the word gossip as the broadest definition of, well, that's people talking about other people, and there's some truth to that. Well, it should be notable to us when the Bible breaks it down into further categories of, well, here's the different types of people who do that, and how many scriptures are dedicated and in strong language to how dangerous and destructive it is. You and I were talking before we started taping about how, we were, did you get this scripture and this scripture? And I said, man, if we'd taken each of us 1 hour before the podcast and just found every correlating scripture on this topic, it would be a lot. The Bible has a lot to say about it. So I guess my point is, it would be easy to underestimate when you're gossiping and how dangerous it is, and the reputation harm it can do, and it can be difficult to recover from that, even if that's not the truth.
Right.
Okay. I have put together 3 tools. Now, I'd like to go over them because outline them first, and then we're going to talk about them in some detail because they're a little ironic when you take my headers. Okay. So, 3 tools. What if you feel like you're the victim of a gossip in particular, or in some ways you feel like your reputation's been harmed, or you feel like people are talking about you? Okay. 1, the question we should ask ourselves, is there anything I can do? Is there anything within my purview that I could do to correct this situation? Second tool, there isn't anything you can do. Let's come back to that. It's deliberately ironic. And then the third one is trust in God. And now, I know that I've been on the listening end of this kind of thing, and I'm like, yeah, sure, trust God. There we go. That's helpful. That's like the most basic thing there is. Well, I've come to realize in our lives, a lot of the trials we go through and the lessons we learn kind of correlate back to God He will find out. Finding out if we trust Him or not.
Right.
And taking matters into our own hands and acting rashly, or even not even acting rashly, but just say, hey, this is a problem, I'm going to take care of it. And not allowing God to have an opportunity. Well, that can cross over into, because we feel like we have to take care of it, because maybe subconsciously we're thinking, because I don't know, is God going to take care of this? I have to take matters into my own hand.
Right. That when it comes to things like this, and like I think I mentioned earlier, once you're in the ministry or in the public eye in any kind of way, you become a source, or not a source, but a subject of gossip or tales or whatever they may be. And it is interesting because you'll see things that are, completely false, and you think, well, man, I feel compelled to do something.
Right.
I feel compelled to somehow write the record. And as we'll talk about, there's just times when it's not.
Yep.
Really the best thing to do is to let God take care of it, which then involves trusting that He will. Yeah.
Okay, so back to tool number 1.
All right.
Let's say you are currently feel like you're the victim of somebody who's talking about you. You've had it happen in the past, even if it's not currently happened. And if it hasn't, well, your future holds probably somebody's going to be talking about you, because that's kind of what we do. So I find this is not limited to just the idea of gossip. This is a crucial Christian principle, in my opinion, that can be applied in every instance. Is there anything I can do? We should always start by evaluating our own life's trials within ourselves. Like, so for the idea of gossip, well, if you sit down and think about it, is there any possibility that you've actually done something to contribute to this? Like maybe you one time said something insensitive that you didn't even think about. It was kind of a throwaway comment, or any of the many ways we can be misinterpreted, and somebody else got offended, and then they start talking about you or gossiping about you. Or maybe you've actually done something that wasn't smart, and now people are talking about you. First rule of thumb, in my opinion, with so many things where we're having any kind of trial or any interpersonal difficulty, is evaluate your own behavior in it. And is there something that you've done to contribute to this problem?
Wow. For the record, denominationally, we are not Pentecostals, but I will give that an amen, Mr. Robinson. It's
I was wondering where you're going with that. I was like, what did I say?
We don't give that. It's so hard to do, and sometimes it's the hardest thing advice you can give someone when they're going through a really difficult time. They say, man, especially when they're prone to blame, just simply blanketly blame themselves for something. Look,
Right.
I'm not saying please don't, right? This is something else someone else has done. Don't pretend that it's somehow something you've done, and yet at the same time, this is a good time to also still examine yourself. Is there anything that you have done to contribute? And it's what the Bible routinely tells us to focus on is, where do we stand with God in this particular situation? What have we chosen to do? Is there something where I have been wronged, but do I have the courage before God to look back in my life and see that maybe this is one link in a chain that I started with another choice? So I can go back and repent of it. I can go back and ask God to fix it. Or is there maybe what is being said is false, but using that not just as a righteous, put up my dukes kind of moment. Put up my dukes. Does anybody say that anymore? It means fists, by the way. It means like putting up your fists like you're going to fight. But think, okay, fine, it's false, but should I examine myself? Is there anything in my behavior that would give cause for people to believe something like that?
Right.
And because
avoid the appearance of evil.
Yes, you highlight, time again, the only thing you can control in this world is you. You are the only thing you can truly control. You can't control what Bobby says. You can't control what Susie says. And yet God has given you yourself to control, and to ignore an opportunity, even if it's viciously false gossip, to ignore the opportunity it may present to examine yourself in some kind of way would be a mistake.
Yep. So that was the perfect segue into point 2, or tool number 2, which is the recognition that there isn't anything you can do about other people. You can only control yourself. So now we might need to be a little bit nuanced about this, because I don't want to eliminate the idea of Matthew 18, which is a solid principle.
Sure.
There is a time, and Mr. Frizz at the feast this year gave actually one of the more fantastic sermons on this, not specifically on Matthew 18, but it was a heavy element of it, which is go quietly and discreetly to the person and see if maybe you can sort out something. Brene Brown, she talks about this Matthew 18 principle, even though she doesn't ever phrase it that way. And the way she phrases it is, you can approach somebody as, hey, I'm hearing X, Y, and Z. So the story I'm making up in my head is, and that way you don't put them on the defensive and you give them a chance to correct it. Oh, Is that what you thought was happening? No, 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 no. That's a misunderstanding, and you clear it up, and that's fantastic.
Okay, let me paraphrase what you just said because I want to make sure I got it right and make sure our listeners do. So, going to your friend, which, by the way, you said Matthew 18, specifically Matthew 18, verse 15. Moreover, if your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him
Yes.
alone. And if he hears you, you've gained your brother. So, talking about what Brene Brown said, you were saying that essentially going to your brother or sister, your friend,
Mm-hmm.
and saying, "Hey, I'm hearing these things, and it's making me think this and this and
Yep.
this." And so you're not trying to put the onus on them, accusing them, but saying at least this is how I'm reacting to what I'm hearing, and then giving them the opportunity to either own it or
Right.
explain how you're wrong.
Right.
But it's not really an accusation.
Well, the underlying principle of Matthew 18, well, this section, you're right, that's a whole chapter, a whole chapter, is winning back your brother.
Right.
And so many people take Matthew 18 as, man, I'm going to tell him
That's
how
right.
he
Matthew
did.
18 gives me an excuse to
Yep,
get in his
yep,
face.
yep. And that's the opposite in some
Right.
ways of what it's supposed to be. So there are times, in fact, more times than we probably care to admit, where we can go to somebody who we think has said something about us and just say, hey, I'm hearing you're saying these things, and give them a chance. But don't put them on the defensive.
Yeah.
But
even give them a chance to say, I didn't say that. It's like, no, here's what I said. I've had that where someone was really offended by something they thought I said.
mm-hmm.
And I said, no, absolutely. In fact, there were other people present. I'm not the only person to say this. Here is what I said.
Right.
And that was enough. That was sufficient to completely clear it up.
So tool number 2 is more in line for where that doesn't work. And you have a couple of people, maybe it's 2 or 3. We tend to go, in my own mind, I tend to think more in female terms because even the Bible itself kind of highlights that it's a little bit more probable with women that they're
Well,
gonna
you're surrounded by them at home, Mr.
Well-
Robinson. That's you're completely you're a
That could
one
be-
man.
That
You're
could
a one.
be a whole other podcast. Okay, but my point is, if there are people, male, female, X group of friends, whatever, who are talking about you behind your back, there is nothing you can do about it. And in fact, I don't think I can relate the story properly, but I had a friend who related to me a lengthy story about how something like this had occurred. He realized there was no way he could set the record straight, and so he didn't even try. And in time, he used tool number 3, which is trust in God, because there's a real power. When Paul talks about, relates how, in his infirmities, he is strong. Like when he's weak, he's strong. Why? We quit trying to do it ourselves. We have to rely on God. And there's a certain power in feeling powerless, as ironic as that is, which means go to God in prayer, say, man, you know what's going on here. I haven't done everything perfectly, but I have not done the things these people say, or they're attacking my my reputation in a way that is just not appropriate. And you've evaluated yourself and you feel this way, and you come before God in prayer. You leave it in God's hands because He is the only one that correct it. I mean, when there's a bunch of moving parts and a bunch of people and everybody's heard this and that and the other, you'll never correct it. You can't go to each person one by one, and people try to do that kind of thing,
Right.
which goes back to tool number 2. Remember, there's nothing you can really do about it. People are going to think what they want to think, and your only hope is to trust in God and put it in His hands, and He wants you to do that so that He can take care of it, and He can take care of it in a way that we never could. And not only that, it is faith building.
Right. I want to make sure that I'm clear, because I love the direction that you're going in. When that point number 2, recognizing there isn't anything you can do, it may not mean there aren't some actions you can't take, in the sense of, for instance, if I were young, which I'm not, but if I were young and I heard some people were saying, oh, Wally Smith, this and that, well, I might at least, I want to make sure my family and my parents know, hey, I hear this. It might be a matter of, if you hear some talk, maybe talking to your pastor, letting them know that, it's my understanding people are accusing me of such and such,
Right.
actually addressing and where you can. But what I love about your point here, number 2, recognizing that there really isn't anything you can do, because no matter what I do, even if I get the record corrected, even if, the minister knows, my teacher knows, if I'm in a school, or my boss knows, my parent knows, the fact is I can't guarantee that, I'm going to make up names, Abigail, Bryce, and Charles, ABC. I just totally made those up. Or young Mr. Ceiling Wall, young Mr. Door Floor, and young Mr. Parking Lot. I can't.
Dwarf floor.
The
I've never heard
Dwarf,
that
you ever
one.
heard Door
No,
Floor? That's one I make every once in a while. I can't guarantee they're not going to do it again.
Right.
Now, so
Right.
what do I do? Well, the Bible does talk about not keeping company with individuals who are essentially sinful or toxic. And so there's things I can do like that, but I have to understand that there's only really so much I can do, and there's a whole world of things I
Right.
can't.
Right.
And those people that get obsessed with saying, no, I've got to make sure I shut so-and-so's mouth. I got to make sure this person
Right.
never, that's when
right.
you actually lead yourself into worse trouble,
Right.
and not moving on to point 3.
Right. No, you're right. If this should actually be terrifying to all of us. If you decide you want to take matters into your own hands, and there's many examples of that in the Bible, God will let you. And you're gonna reap the consequences one way or the other of how you tried to work it out.
Right.
One of the other things I like about putting things in God's hands, beyond I shouldn't even say merely, beyond just you need Him to resolve a situation that you don't have the power to resolve, is also a thing I've come to really, really appreciate about God is His mercy and His justice. And what I mean by that is you also don't have all the facts. And maybe somebody you thought was being particularly bad or caustic or what it turns out was not. Or maybe they weren't behaving properly, but something happened and it got their attention and they thought, you know what, maybe I shouldn't have been talking like that. And so when you put a matter into God's hands, 1, He's the only one that can resolve some situations. 2, He'll be just about it because He does know all the facts, and then He'll render to each according to His works, if you will. And He'll you know what, I can't remember even where I heard this, minimum necessary force to resolve a situation. It's not like poor John and James who were ready to call down fire from heaven. That was out of proportion to what was going on there. And so you can have this real trust that God will not merely handle your situation, but do it in a good and a just way. And we're not equipped not only to not do that, but we don't have all the facts. And I've learned to appreciate how difficult it is to actually 100% say an accurate thing,
Right.
because there's some things we don't know. We think, I think tomorrow I'm going to go to services in Charlotte, but things happen.
That's right. If God permits, that's what's going to happen, but He might have other plans. One of my, personally, in terms of your point 3 about, trusting God and putting those things in His hand, one of my favorite verses about that is when Peter is talking about what Jesus Christ did and saying straight up in 1 Peter 2 and verse 21 that Christ left us this example and that we should follow in His steps. And it says in verse 22, first, it's a matter of making sure that your actions and character are what they should be, and then doing the next step. So in 1 Peter 2 and verse 22, speaking of Christ as our example, Peter says that Christ committed no sin, nor was deceit found in His mouth. So He did focus on His own conduct, made sure it was what it's supposed to be. But then verse 23, who when He was reviled, did not revile in return. When He suffered, He did not threaten. Rather, it says, He committed Himself to Him who judges righteously. And there's times when you do all that you can to, say, protect your reputation, talk to those who are responsible, talk to those whom you should try to have a good accounting of, but recognize there's limits to what you can do, and you've just got to turn. I'm not going to quote Frozen, let it go. Well, I guess I did just now quote Frozen. But you just get to a point you have to let that go and recognize, who is ultimately the judge? It's God.
Mm-hmm.
And as long as I know I'm right with Him, I can be fine with that. I can be completely fine with that. Every once in a while you'll say, "Oh, I saw someone said this, terrible thing about you on Facebook, or something else." And at least in the ministry, again, you get used to it. Let alone being on the telecast, you're a public person, and so people are going to say things. I was just talking with someone. I've been accused of being a Democrat and a Biden voter. And I've been accused of being a Trump lover and MAGA,
but
person.
also a Trump hater.
That's right. I get it. I get on both sides. I've been accused of everything, but what I can't do is go to every individual person and correct that.
That's a good example.
I've got to just trust that God knows, what I am and what I'm doing. I've got to focus on the part where I'm committing no sin, that no deceit is found in my mouth, and then behaving in such a way that I'm accountable in all that I see and do, that I'm trying to do right, but then just trust God to sort those things out and not feel like I got to track it down all myself.
I might add, not even add, but just to round out this point for my third tool there of trusting God. And a component of that is to be patient and be determined. Like, don't give up. I've heard this a lot in sermons and sermonettes of, God wants you to be persistent in your prayers to him. It's not like go like 3 times and say, God, I don't know, these guys are talking about me. What can you do? No, every day if you can, and be prepared to do it for a while. God likes to, he likes to see our persistence. We don't have to read it, but Luke 18 verses 1-8, you might take note of. It's the story of the persistent widow. She goes to the unjust judge who doesn't fear anybody, and she keeps pleading her case, and finally he just gets tired of it, and he brings her justice because she's wearying him with her prayers, and God makes the point that, hear what the unjust judge says. Will not God avenge his own elect who cry out to him? So,
right.
We do have to be aware that God may resolve the issue in a way that we didn't expect. So,
right.
It's not always what we think it's going to be, but it will be just.
Yeah, and you just have to trust him for that. Now, before I wrap up, because we've gone on for a while, you actually had a point that I appreciated in your show prep notes about the other way around. Not if you've been affected by gossip, but what if you yourself are one? And that's what we do need to be willing to focus on. It's part of the danger in all of this, as you mentioned earlier, is that we can focus on what other people are doing, when really God wants us to focus on ourselves. In fact, if we're not willing to address our own potential to be a gossip or a talebearer, then why should he advocate on our behalf, in the case of others when we're having tales told about us? And what was your recommendation concerning those where we want our listeners to consider? It's kind of a fourth point, if you will. But what if you are yourself a gossip?
I had a brief interaction with my daughter, Maddie, this morning. Told her what we were going to talk about, and asked, because sometimes she'll have some really good suggestions.
Mm-hmm.
And she talked about how in her own life she's been grappling with when you say something, when you don't, what's appropriate, what's inappropriate. And I told her, I said, I understand 100%. Like in my 20s, I'm an extrovert. In my 20s, man, you wouldn't need to guess if I was an extrovert or not. And I had a couple interactions that made me realize that not everybody was as amused by my constant witty commentary as I was. And so I'm actually made it a point of focus in my own life. And so what are the results? Well, 30 years later, I have friends that wonder if I'm actually an extrovert. Why? Because one of the best ways to stop gossiping is you just eliminate broad categories of things you won't say. You just talk less is an element of it. But I do have one final proverb that addresses this that I like quite a lot. And so this goes under the category of, because when in my article, you have all these different categories of people who are involved in gossip, and they range from the foolish all the way to the talebearer who's actively soliciting slanderous information. But there's a counterpoint with the wise. What should the wise do in the matter of gossiping?
Okay.
Proverbs 11, verses 12-13. He who is devoid of wisdom, just think about that for a minute. Devoid, like without, no wisdom, despises his neighbor. And remember, neighbor is like our groups. When I was young, I was too literal. Our neighbor. Like literally the guy that lives next door to me? No, that's everybody that's in your social circle is your neighbor. Everybody you interact with is your neighbor. So who is devoid of wisdom? He who is devoid of wisdom despises his neighbor, but of man of understanding holds his peace. A talebearer reveals secrets, but he who is of a faithful spirit conceals a matter. So I have 2 thoughts about that. One, I have been in that situation a couple of times where I know something that I didn't even want to know, but I'm aware that if I said something about it, it would have catastrophic effects for the other person. And in pretty much every instance where I don't feel like, we talked about earlier, well, if somebody's in danger to themselves or others,
Absolutely.
You should speak up. But in these, it would do nothing but cause the person harm. And I don't want to be a person who's in that situation. No, what I mean is He who desires mercy ought himself to be merciful. Who knows what's going on?
Right.
I'm just going to keep that to myself. I'm going to be discreet with the information I have. It doesn't mean that you're covering up a sin, because that's one thing I think people could read this and think, so what, the wise, they conceal a matter, or they're covering over a wrong?
Right. You're not saying that.
No, not saying that. They're just discreet. They understand that people make mistakes. I make mistakes. And, let's cut each other a little bit of slack and not blabber about it to all our friends, and especially the far more dangerous social media aspect, which has dramatically increased our capability of hurting people.
Right. It's a megaphone on a megaphone on a megaphone, and you can't control it. Once you do that, you can't control it. It's kind of like, say, when you throw a rock. Well, the moment it leaves your fingers, you're not in charge of that rock anymore.
Right.
You don't get
That's
to pick where it's going to land. And what you said reminds me of one of my favorite proverbs, because it tends to smack me around. I tend to be a verbose person. You could say with 3 words, hey, why not 8 words? So, editing is always very difficult. You want to be concise. But it's in Proverbs 10 and verse 19, in the multitude of words, sin is not lacking, but he who restrains his lips is wise. And I used to wonder, well, is it just because you say a lot of words? No, it's not just because of the high quantity of words. An article that's 4,000 words long isn't necessarily less righteous than an article that's 2,000 words long. But the fact is, the more there is that when it comes to passing things along, when it comes to sin, it tends to be an abundance of things,
Yes.
right? It tends to be in that abundance, versus the Bible routinely emphasizes, like you just did, discretion. That if you examine yourself, maybe there is a time to say something. Mr. Weston used to say, you need to understand, does something need to be said? Are you the person to say it, and is this the time to say it? And that doesn't necessarily mean to someone else, like a rumor or something. That means in dealing with a situation with the individual that you need to deal with. On the other hand, when you're doing what you mentioned a while ago in terms of asking yourself, what are the ramifications of me saying this? Am I helping someone? Am I literally helping someone by telling someone else, like a parent, or that this person may be in danger, this person might be harming themselves, this is a sin that needs to be addressed? Or am I really just actually making things worse? Am I actually just going to be hurting a reputation unnecessarily? And when you examine that, more often than not, I won't guarantee every time, of course, but kind of in line with that proverb, more often than not, you're going to find the choice is probably not to say, is to actually practice some discretion.
Exactly. That's why that was kind of my point I was trying to make earlier. Why do I talk less? Because of that exact principle you highlighted right there.